Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. We will reconvene Gaming Commission meeting number 110 on February 26th at 9:35. This is a continuation of our evaluation and eventual deliberation of the RFA2 applications from the three Category 2 applicants. Yesterday we did the site and building design and finance, and today we will hope to do the remaining three: mitigation, economic development, and the general overview section. We yesterday had some questions raised both by the commission, first by the commission that required a little more research, and we also invited applicants to notify us if they thought that anything they saw constituted a factual mistake in the presentations. Those were to go to Ombudsman Ziemba, and he and staff would vet and, if necessary, bring them to our attention. Ombudsman Ziemba, do you want to bring us up to date on where you
are? Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We received a number of questions from applicants as late as I think 11 o'clock last night. We're reviewing those questions. In some regards, they may have veered beyond just issues of fact involving questions of interpretation by the commissioners or interpretations by the teams. And so what we are asking each of the applicants to do for further questions is to please just stick with questions of fact or material errors of fact that were raised in the presentations. I understand that if a commissioner is making what in the opinions of an applicant is a mistaken interpretation, the difference between interpretation and fact could be contested. In that regard, what we will do is that we will work with each of the individual commissioners in charge of the area to determine what of the questions are questions of material fact of error, material error of fact, and which are new issues or supplements to the application, and then we will address those questions which are material errors. In regard to timing, what I was going to recommend is that potentially what we could do is we would answer all of the questions as a group. Further presentations are forthcoming today, and potentially what we could do is we could set aside some time, maybe perhaps tomorrow morning, to address all those questions as one group. And given that staff needs some time to work with the commissioners on these questions, we potentially may want to establish a timetable or a timeline for sending those questions to us, perhaps something like 2 hours after the close of the presentations. All those questions need to be presented to the commission and its staff.
So bottom line, what you're suggesting is, first of all, that everybody be reminded that this is a matter of raising what an applicant believes was a mistake of fact in the presentation. This is not an opportunity to answer questions that we've raised that were not answered in the Phase 2 application. This is not an opportunity to enhance. This is not an opportunity to debate our interpretations. This is an opportunity to correct facts. That's number one. Number two, you're suggesting that relative to today's presentations, that we set a 2-hour deadline from the time we adjourn today to 2 hours thereafter for factual issues to be presented to you. And three, you're suggesting that you come back to us sometime tomorrow, presumably first thing in the morning if you're ready, which would be good because that will precede our then beginning to deliberate on the process, deliberate on what we've heard. That at that point you will address both questions from yesterday and questions from today.
Correct, and in the meantime, I'll try to find time to work with the commissioners on those questions.
Okay, I just want to make sure that, work with the commissioners means what?
So I will forward the questions to the individual commissioners in charge of that area.
So if a question is raised about Commissioner McHugh's area,
correct,
you'll communicate with him, but I didn't want people to think that we would be talking about the answers to these questions amongst ourselves. That will not be the case.
That is correct.
You're talking about going to the individual commissioner about whose presentation the question was raised. Fine.
Yep.
Okay. Now, there also were raised a couple of questions, at least a couple questions by commissioners about the presentations. where the presenter, Commissioner Zuniga or Commissioner McHugh, was going to go back and do some work with his team. And to make this all simple, let's lump the answers to those issues and any others that come up today from the presentations into tomorrow's early, first of the thing in the morning presentations as well. So we'll postpone your questions and yours, Commissioner, until tomorrow as well.
And perhaps the commissioner and I can determine who goes first to see what happens tomorrow.
I would just, it occurs to me, two things that occurred to me. I want to reiterate what I said yesterday morning, which is that we now come to crunch time. Everybody's been involved in this a long time. There's been a tremendous commitment of resources and passion by a lot of people, applicants, host communities, public officials, surrounding communities. We will have to make a decision. One will be selected probably, two will not. And that's in the nature of life and in the nature of the process and in the nature of capitalism, and that's the way it is. But I want to reiterate the appreciation that I at least have for all of you folks. And I can imagine that it must be kind of challenging in some cases to see us sitting here talking about your futures. But I think that's an awful lot better than if we had these conversations in private and only came out with a decision. The purpose here, it was in the legislative intent, and I think we've interpreted the legislative intent as broadly as it can be interpreted in terms of the transparency of the process. You and the public have the right to hear how we analyze and evaluate these applications, how we interpret them, what values we impose, what questions we have, and how we eventually make this decision. It's a little bit in the nature of the sausage process that everybody talks about, but in the final analysis, I think it's in the public interest and the right thing to do. So just by way of introduction.
Thank you.
Everybody okay with that process?
Yes.
Yep. Any other comments before we get started? Okay. We will start with Commissioner Cameron on the mitigation evaluation criteria.
Good morning, Mr. Chair, fellow commissioners, and everyone here in attendance. Good morning.
Good morning. Good morning.
So the portion of the application that I evaluated was mitigation. And I thought I'd start by, I don't know that it's clear when you hear mitigation what that really means. So this is kind of a loose definition of what mitigation is when it comes to this evaluation process. So what we really evaluated was how does the applicant demonstrate community support, mitigate any impacts with the host and surrounding communities, address the traffic issues, promote responsible gaming and address problem gambling, and protect and enhance the lottery. So those were the topics with regard to mitigation that we took a look at. So as just an overview, we grouped the 38 questions from the application into 4 criteria. Community support, which, I deemed the most important, frankly, and that included the host community agreements, the surrounding community agreements, and the impacted live entertainment venues. Traffic, also very important, and other off-site impacts. All of them were very important, by the way, but let me say that. But the third one is measures to promote responsible gaming and mitigate problem gambling and protect and enhance the lottery. In particular, the last category, we had a number of questions that we started informally referring to as check-the-box questions. They had to provide information or they agreed to comply with our regulations. A number of questions with responsible gaming and the questions with the lottery were more in that category, which is why we're really going to focus quite a bit of time on the community support and traffic and other impacts. So this methodology is probably in keeping with my training and experience. I tend to look at things as kind of a mini investigation. The who, what, when, where, and why of mitigation is how we approached the materials. And the who are the consultants and the subject matter experts that assisted me. What materials did we look at? What events, what materials? The review process, the when, it started back on October 4th, the day these Category 2 applications were due, and it's continued right up and through today. The where, location, location, location. With mitigation, location was site-specific. What was appropriate and negotiated in one community, it was different than something in another community, and we had 3 applicants that were very site-specific, and we did look at our presentation from that lens. And the why. Why is mitigation so important to communities? And it really is important, and as you see, we spent a lot of time and effort really reviewing the materials that dealt with the communities and their voice in this whole process. So we've all used the same ratings, so I'm not going to go through and read them all, but what's in particularly important to this presentation is the sufficient rating. And I say that because of the number of questions that, if you see that second part of the definition, provided the required or requested information. In addition, there were forms that the applicants had to sign agreeing to comply with regulations. So there were just about, a good portion of our questions that fell into that, so there'll be a number of sufficients because they really all agreed to comply and/or provided the requested information. So we're up to the who section, and I feel, excuse me, I feel like I was very fortunate to have an excellent team to advise me on some technical aspects of this mitigation evaluation. Our director of problem gambling, research and problem gambling, Mark Vanderlinden, was invaluable. He brought in another expert, Jeff Murata, who has his own company, Problem Gambling Solutions, to assist with all of the questions in dealing with responsible gaming. Gordon Carr from MGC Strategies, we share the same initials, so we chuckled about that, but he has, one of the nice things about this is the people you get to know along the way, and Gordon has been invaluable. Common sense, 20 years experience in economic development and project management, so he was very valuable to the team. McFarland Johnson and Green International, these folks really helped with the traffic, with mitigation. In addition, we had Rick Moore from City Point Partners, who has helped us recently with some of the traffic concerns. So, important part of the team. Pink and Company, Nancy, Melissa, and Alex were excellent at helping us keep on track, scheduling meetings, really put the presentation together. And Kathy O'Toole, who is one of our gaming consultants, just a common sense, public safety mostly, but best practices, and she did give me some advice that I'll try to adhere to, which is be brief, be brilliant, and be seated. So let's see if I can comply. The what part of this presentation, we looked at, of course, all of the questions pertaining to mitigation in the Category 2 applications. We had input, we considered the input from the public meetings and the hearings, the applicant presentations to the commission, environmental documents. When I talk about environmental documents, Mass Environmental Protection Agency draft environmental impact reports, traffic impact and access studies, regional planning agency reports. There were a number of additional documents that we considered for mitigation. Public comment letters and emails. I know the chair mentioned yesterday that there were thousands, and we really did look at every single one, and it was really important to mitigation to have a good sense of what the public was thinking and what their comments were. Site visits by subject matter experts and the commissioners, and that's the sites, the proposed sites here, as well as sites where these applicants have other gaming establishments. And website research. I know in particular for responsible gaming, there was a lot of website work done and information gleaned about the applicants and their other jurisdictions. So the when. We just put a little timeline here together. I think it's important to note that, you know, again, I mentioned October 4th, these were submitted. That following week, we had applicant presentations. That following week, we had site visits by the experts. And again, a week later, surrounding community hearings. We move into, and every single week throughout this schedule, our team met and spent an awful lot of time reading materials, evaluating materials, understanding how we would put this together. So we had pretty much weekly meetings. In December, we had host community hearings. Into January, the commissioners took site visits, and we are here today presenting the findings. So an awful lot of work was put into the process. So the where, we looked at maps yesterday, but what we included here was not only the host communities and where they're located, but all of the surrounding communities. So the blue lines are the surrounding communities that the applicants reached agreements with. See, there's a dotted, kind of a black or dark blue line that really differentiates the host communities from Plainville and Raynham. But I think this was an important visual because an awful lot of work was put into these surrounding and nearby community agreements. And that just gives you an idea of those communities that had a vote. Oh, thank you. The chair would like me to use a tool here and be able to point out, but it's a good point. So we just differentiates the difference between the two facilities. So these are the three proposed facilities here in the Commonwealth. And what I'd like to say about this is just that we were fortunate to have, and we would talk about this as we reviewed the materials. We have three strong applicants, made the job very difficult. I think there's an overall recognition by all of us that any one of them can run a successful facility. So we are fortunate to have the quality of the applicants that we do have. And with regard to mitigation, they really are site-specific, these facilities. So why, mitigation is very important, but why is it important? Why was it an important part of this, this evaluation process? You know, it's really important that the community voices be heard. Traffic issues are a concern to the general public. Applicants play a key role in promoting responsible gaming, so we asked them a number of questions along these lines to see how they, what they do in other jurisdictions and what they propose to do here. And of course, it's important to protect and enhance the lottery, the most successful lottery in the country, and I think all of the applicants took that responsibility seriously as well. And we'll talk more about these individually. This is really the why. Oh, our first criterion, community support, just a visual from one of our several meetings out in a surrounding community. So we grouped community support into 5 different areas. The content of the host community agreements, there were a number of questions with regard to that. The host community agreements, election-related material, public support and public outreach, surrounding communities, and the regional venues, the ILEVs. I mentioned before that community support was really, we had the most questions and we spent an awful lot of time on this area. So I'm going to get right into the ratings and then spend time where there's a difference. I'm going to spend time where there really is a difference in the ratings. So for the content of the host community agreements, I determined that they were all very good. What we didn't think would be appropriate to do was compare one to the other and say, hey, this one's a little more lucrative, we're going to give that community a higher score, because they were reached with those public officials. All of the communities, the host communities, were very pleased with the agreements, and rather than look at them individually, what we did is look at the time and effort that went into those agreements, and we thought, since this is a new this is not done typically in other jurisdictions where you need to come to agreements with the host community, the surrounding communities. So we gave them all a very good for the time and effort that went into that process. The next category is the host community agreements, election-related materials. In addition to election, we're talking about advertising and contributions that come under this category of questions. They were all sufficient. This was one of those check the box. They all supplied the relevant and requested information with this category. So they all were sufficient with regard to the materials that go with that host community agreement. The public support and outreach, as we can see, there is a difference here. So I'm going to spend more time talking about this in a minute, because again, this is a unique process. And with the ILEVs, we really think the impacted venues, this probably may be more significant in the category ones, where the size of entertainment venues will be more in line with some of those facilities. But there were marketing agreements, and there was one ILEV that was signed off on, so they were all sufficient in this category.
Commissioner, I'm curious, which was the ILEV that was signed for? Is
That was the music circus in Cohasset that Raynham signed an agreement with. So when we talk about, the one other thing I wanted to say about surrounding, surrounding community, where I gave them all a very good, I didn't spend enough time on this. Thank you, John, for going back. So this was a new process for all of them. They each approached this differently. For example, some of the things we were impressed by, Plainville, there were no petitions, for example. They created a model agreement that others used portions of that agreement. So, their approach was successful in that region. Now, Leominster successfully came through the process, but one of the things that impressed us was, for example, Fitchburg was not designated by this commission to be a surrounding community yet. Leominster, the applicant, went back and entered into an agreement. They wanted to be a good neighbor, so we thought that was a point of reference. And with Raynham, it took them a little longer. They had a couple of surrounding communities that almost started the arbitration process, but they stayed with it. They got through the process. They used what was called a nearby community agreement, where the impacts may not have qualified them for surrounding, but yet they, again, in an effort to be a good neighbor, entered into these agreements. And with regard to two of the surrounding community agreements that took more time, we received letters from those communities saying we wanted to be treated as an individual, not using a template. They listened to us. It took longer, but we're very pleased with the agreement. So all the approaches, were different, but very good and successful. Thus, the very good rating for all the surrounding communities. So where there is a difference is the public support and outreach. some of the key factors in evaluating this aspect of the evaluation of the criterion, the responses to the questions that the applicants provided, presentations by the applicants, the input from the public hearing, the results of the referendums in each community, the public outreach efforts, and the letters and emails, again, hundreds and hundreds of letters and emails. Some communities more than others, but we did receive a number from each of these. The referendum votes, Leominster 61%, Plainville 76%, Raynham 86%. One of the things we considered was the fact that an existing facility with years and decades of being a good neighbor probably helped along these lines. The community was familiar and had obviously liked what the way in which they integrated into the community. So I think in particular Raynham at 86% demonstrated that, and we saw that at the hearings that we held, the letters that we've received. There is negligible example of opposition in Raynham. Plainville also had a very strong favorable vote, 76%. Again, an existing facility had done a lot of work in the community. I received more letters yesterday from folks in the Plainville. So we decided not to count the amount of letters because we didn't want to be inaccurate, and they come in as we speak, really voicing mostly support for the project. And Leominster, I feel like they did a good job. They were, it's a new facility. They didn't have as much time, but they did a good job. They have made efforts, especially with the outreach. They've done a lot of things with the community, but there does remain some consistent opposition there, thus the sufficient rating with Leominster and the community support. So our second criterion, traffic and off-site impacts. This is not one of the, that picture was not of one of the sites. It's just general Massachusetts traffic. As we did with the earlier criterion, this is grouped. There are three groupings when it comes to traffic and off-site impacts. The impact and assessment costs, what we're talking about here is the off-site infrastructure, utilities, roadways. The traffic mitigation plan. How does the applicant propose to mitigate the impacts of added traffic and other potential impacts that were explored, housing, school population, and emergency services? When it comes to this particular grouping of questions, traffic management plan becomes the most important. All of our experts have taken a look at other impacts, and because of the size of this facility, there really is, there will not be in the prognosis of those experts impacts to housing, school population, or emergency services. And the impact assessments and costs, all of the applicants have agreed to pay these additional costs, and that's typical with a development of this size. So the traffic management plan becomes the most important with this grouping of questions. Again, we go to the ratings, and I'll spend the time talking about the differences. Because all three have agreed to cover those costs, standard procedure, they are all sufficient when it comes to impact assessments. Traffic management plan, there really is some differences here, and I'll explain that in a moment because I'll go into detail about those differences. And I just explained the other impacts that there is not expected impacts because of the size of this project. So we get into the traffic management plan for Leominster first, and as you can see, I am following the same alphabetical order as my colleagues when it comes to explaining each applicant. And the rating is very good for Leominster and their traffic management plan. This is an example of some of the traffic management plan provided by the applicant. The map there that comes directly from the application. Some of the key factors in determining their rating: they have good access to major highways, interchanges, and local roads. They've committed to extending the bus route. They've committed to providing a shuttle to the commuter rail station. And they have made road improvements which will support bike and pedestrian access. So for those reasons, it was a more detailed plan than the others, with more commitments to the community for access to their facility. This map, it really, what the examples are: this is Jungle Road and 117, turn lanes and traffic signal improvements. It's hard to see, that's not a very large map, but that's, those are the mitigation, areas of mitigations that they point out to us in this map. And it was really more detailed than the other applicants. And another advantage of this site is the fact that the nearby highway system has available capacity for future traffic. So that was taken into consideration as well. Plainville, a sufficient rating for their traffic management plan. Again, this was provided by the applicant. They're close to major highways and interchange. The site access improvements are under review at this time. They are committed to provide intersection improvements off-site. So, as Commissioner McHugh mentioned yesterday, the median cut is, preferred, but that is under review at this time. It may or may not be approved, but the applicant has expressed a willingness to work with either alternative. So whatever comes back as the approved alternative, they are on board and will work with the state and local officials to make that happen.
Commissioner, did the DOT letter that came in late last week,
Yes.
did that change your assessment here at all?
It did not change our assessment. Again, we're looking at this through the lens of mitigation, and in particular with this applicant, they have agreed to mitigate whatever the approved plan is. They have agreed to work in that direction to make those improvements.
But
So one is more ideal than the other, obviously, but for our perspective, mitigation, the commitments are there to.
But I got the sense from yesterday that DOT has said we want to go with the improved jug handle, but the city, the town, has said we don't want to do anything further to the jug handle. And
Well,
is that new information?
well,
that-
in speaking
I
with
think-
my traffic experts who have, in fact, been able to reach into DOT and talk through the letter with them, different folks at DOT are looking at different aspects of this, and it's not clear yet. I think is the best way to, it's just not clear what the final approved plan will be. But I think what was important to our evaluation is the applicant's willingness to work in whatever direction is there that ends up being approved. I think you're right, Mr. Chair, that the local officials have a strong preference, and there's some ongoing conversations about crashes, the number of crashes, the severity of crashes. So I know that those discussions are ongoing, and there is no resolution yet. I know, Ombudsman Zamba, that's There'll be answers in greater detail to some of those traffic questions tomorrow, or traffic factual information. But with regard to mitigation, what was important to us is the fact that the applicant, and there are letters to demonstrate that the applicant is on board with the officials and whatever direction that ends up being, whatever the final decision is. This applicant, Plainville, has also committed to 2 off-site intersection improvements. That's the intersection of Route 106 and 152, and Route 1 and 106. Some extra signage, signal modifications, and lane realignments may be required. But they're sufficient. There aren't as many commitments, but they are certainly, from a mitigation stand, doing what they need to do to move forward here. Rainham. Some of the rating factors for that sufficient rating, there's some distance. There are a couple of miles from the major highway interchanges. Some additional off-site intersection improvements may be required. They weren't committed to in the application. There's no firm commitment to make those off-site improvements, but as I've been educated from our traffic experts, certainly you're required to do what with DOT, their requirements, and they will adhere to whatever those requirements are. That's clear. There's a sufficient rating. So to wrap this criterion up, Leominster received a very good, and mainly due to their traffic, their very detailed traffic plan and their commitments with regard to traffic and public transportation. Plainville and Rainham are sufficient. Leominster, their site has very good access, underutilized interstate highway. They've agreed to existing infrastructure and public transit access. As I pointed out, all the applicants must comply with the MEPA and obtain their state and local permits, so they will be making whatever improvements are deemed necessary. And all the applicants have agreed to address local traffic impacts through their host and surrounding community agreements. And as we pointed out earlier, there were no significant impacts to housing, school population, and emergency services. So we'll move on to...
Could I just ask one question?
Yes, sir.
Commissioner, before you move on. With respect to the Rainham applicant, is there anything that you have to say about the portion of the DOT letter, last Friday letter, that talked about improvements to the intersection of 106 and 138? The letter speaks for itself. I just wondered if there was anything you wanted to
Right.
say
I'm
about that.
going to ask Rick if he has any additional, where is Rick? Additional information on that. We did not spend a great deal of time from the mitigation standpoint on
Okay.
that intersection. Is there
Okay.
anything additionally you'd like to add to that?
No, but DOT will work with the town to accelerate that if needed.
Okay. Why don't you?
Commissioners, Rick Moore, City Point Partners. That intersection is under design. It's due to go out to bid shortly. The normal process of getting that up and running would take so many months. It's our opinion that if the license goes to Rainham, that Rainham and DOT will be able to work to make this improvement in time for an opening in sometime in probably 2015.
Thank you.
Can I also ask a question related to traffic and surrounding communities? I remember from our designation times, in the case of Leominster, the Bolton community was designated because there was a particular intersection of concern around the 495 exit, if I remember correctly, and then traffic that then backs up on 117. Bolton obviously reached, the applicant reached an agreement with Bolton, and those traffic concerns are deemed to be mitigated?
Yes, they all, in particular, the Leominster project had communities with traffic issues. And they've reached agreements with all of them. They've reached agreements, and they, of course, as part of this process, they will have to abide by their host and surrounding community agreements. So next, we move on to measures to promote responsible gaming. And this is our third, 4 criteria. This is the third. These are just some brochures that were picked up at the, I'm going to thank my colleague who did a very good job. Commissioner Stebbins did a good job of picking up some brochures for me. And these are just examples of brochures from our applicants' other jurisdictions. So, again, the groupings, we group the questions into 3 areas. And the first are the direct efforts to mitigate problem gambling and promote responsible gaming. What we're talking about here is the on-site resources for problem gambling, self-exclusion policies, identification of problem gambling, credit extension abuse, and treatment and prevention. That all comes under the direct efforts to mitigate. The second group is the process and the measures to mitigate problems. This is the code of ethics, the metrics for problem gambling, and the historical efforts against problem gambling with these applicants. And the third grouping are the indirect efforts to mitigate problem gambling. What we're talking about here are the advertising and the signage. You know, how do you let people, your patrons, know? And you know, we visually inspected signs in the facilities, and they answered questions with regard to these 2 areas as well. So group 1 is, we're talking about the general activities the applicants will do on-site in coordination with community providers. So that's important with group 1. Examples, how do you train your employees? And what resources are available on-site. And with group 3, I mean, I think group 2 is self-explanatory. Those are the exact pieces of that, those are the questions in that grouping. Group 3, though, these are the passive ways the applicant will work to promote responsible gaming and educate about problem gambling. How do they inform patrons about these issues? So those were the questions that were asked of the applicants. Again, we'll start with the ratings, and again, I'll spend more time talking about the areas where there is a difference. So for group 1, as we can see, Leominster received a sufficient, Plainville a very good, and Raynham a sufficient. So in general, all the applicants agreed to comply with regulations that we will adopt, our commission will adopt. Generally, they're all in line with the American Gaming Association Responsible Gaming Code of Conduct. But Plainville did a better job comparing, compared to the others, defining the on-site space for counseling, a responsible gaming office, and they also clearly define the connections to the community providers and the Massachusetts Council on Compulsive Gambling. So they have reached out and made those efforts. So the process and the measures to mitigate problems, again, sufficient for Leominster, very good for Plainville, and sufficient for Raynham. Plainville best describes the areas in which metrics are collected and in line with our priorities, MGC priorities. Plainville has a strong history in other jurisdictions promoting responsible gambling and addressing problem gambling. Generally, all the applicants did an adequate job of describing the code of ethics. None of the applicants adequately addressed how to effectively measure the programs. But this is an evolving field and an evolving practice. I know in discussion with Director Vanden Linden, I said, this isn't the only field that struggles with the metrics, how to collect the data, analyze the data, and then make effective change because of the results of the data. So this is an evolving field, so it's not that our three applicants happen to be behind the curve here. It's really an area that's taking shape. All of the applicants provided sufficient responses to the questions regarding advertising and signage. I'm in group 3 here. We were able to observe the signage on site visits. We saw the brochures, and so they were all sufficient in this category. They're doing what is the norm in the industry, I think we could say.
Could I ask one question before
Sure.
we jump on? And that is, was there any difference between the three applicants with respect to credit extension policies?
Mark, jump in if you can answer this. They all, general answers about, we're not going to extend credit to folks who can't afford it, but there were no detailed plans on how they would evaluate that. There were general statements made that this is what they plan to do. They won't extend that credit. But again, we would have liked to see more detail in how they would do that.
Did any say anything about their collection practices?
They did not. Do you have more to add to that?
And there was not an indication of what their collection practices were.
Thank you.
Just as a point, I think that to follow up on Commissioner McHugh's, I think we have a raised sensitivity to both the issue of the mechanisms by which credit judgments are made, and collection because of the recent Globe piece, and appropriately so. And so we may want to make a note as we're thinking about conditions later on. We didn't look as aggressively at these two issues as we might have, and I think as we would now if we were doing it over again. So I think it might be something just to keep in mind when we get to the conditions, that these are areas we may want to probe.
And I know Director Vanden Linden is working with this topic and intends to recommend regulations with
Right.
regard to this.
Right.
Do you want to add to that?
Right. We'll be looking at, in the next week or so, and introducing the responsible gaming framework, and credit extension is an important but not isolated piece of
Right.
that responsible gaming
Right,
framework.
and I know you were working on this before the media comments on this, which is great, but I just want to make sure we keep the very high level of attention.
I'm glad the question was asked, because we did spend a little time, in particular, going back to that question and looking at the responses, which again were, in general, we will not issue credit, but there was not a plan. How do you make that determination as to what are the standards? So that for all of them, they were lacking in that area.
Thank you.
So to wrap up number 3 here, the responsible gaming rating. Overall, Leominster was a sufficient, Plainville a very good, and Raynham a sufficient. The key factors. Plainville has experience, and they demonstrated that in their responses to operating and integrating responsible gambling practices into their 28 casino and racing operations. Plainville's responsible gambling practices appear to meet, and in a number of cases exceed, the American Gaming Association Responsible Code of Conduct. And all the applicants agreed to comply with our regulations that we will adopt along with regard to responsible gaming. So the 4th criterion is to protect and enhance the lottery. The statute made this a key provision. The Massachusetts revenue per capita for lottery spending is very high, and it's important to preserve that revenue and add to it with a new gaming facility. And there were only a couple of questions, and they were Again, the category that we considered check the box, provide us with the information. The question itself, applicant to provide a description of plans and efforts the applicant would take to avoid any negative impacts on the revenue generated by the Mass State Lottery. Frankly, none of the proposals were particularly creative or robust with regard to this. But all applicants did commit, as required by law, to work collaboratively with the state lottery, and they all have signed agreements with the lottery. Thus, I deem them all to be sufficient in this category.
Commissioner, I suppose the signed agreement is the best indication, but are we able to glean whether there's differences among those agreements, significant or otherwise?
Very much like the host community agreements, well, we had no part of those agreements. Both parties signed those agreements. It's just a sufficient rating for that. I know one may have used the others as an example of, kind of wanting to do something similar to another applicant. So the lottery signed off on all three of them, and we deem that to be sufficient.
Thank you. Just following up with that, I would point out that we did ask the lottery to help us assess the lottery enhancement and lottery protection strategies and help us brainstorm on what those strategies might be and so forth, and they declined to participate.
That's true.
Yeah, and I know the applicants, knew that they had to do this, and they went and got those agreements signed. So overall, in wrapping up the categories, the overall, as you can see below, those are the individual criteria and the individual scores. Plainville overall gets a very good rating because they were very good in two key areas, which was the community support as well as the problem gambling. Leominster was very good with their traffic impacts and their traffic management plan, sufficient ratings in community support, problem gambling, and the lottery, thus an overall sufficient rating. Raynham, very strong community support, and sufficient with traffic impacts, problem gambling, and the lottery, and thus an overall sufficient rating. I'm not going to read all of these. It's just a summary of, just give you some highlights from each category. With Leominster, they were effective in reaching agreements with hosts and surrounding communities. They had strong support from public officials. Public opposition was registered at public hearings and through comment letters. Very strong in site location, proximity to underutilized interstate highways. They identified roadway and transit related to mitigation to include a bike and pedestrian on Jungle Road, new traffic signals, extending local bus lines, providing a shuttle to the commuter rail station. The comments received from Mass DOT on the proposed mitigation and access plans indicate that there's some refinements that will be needed. This is a recent letter. Some refinements that will be needed. Some modifications to the interchange of I-190. They outlined their responsible gaming plan from Maryland Live. They expressed support for responsible gaming and agreed to comply with all of our regulations, and they executed an agreement with the lottery. Plainville, the applicant was effective in reaching agreements with host and surrounding communities. They created a model that was used by other applicants. Host community referendum passed by a wide margin. Negligible opposition was registered at the public hearings and through public comments as well. The site is located close to the major interstate highway interchange. The preferred access improvements are currently under review. They've committed to mitigate all the off-site roadway improvements. They have an integrated responsible gaming practice in their casino and racetracks in many there are many jurisdictions. They meet and exceed, in some cases, the American Gaming Association reasonable code of conduct. They agreed to comply with all of our regulations, and they also have a signed agreement with the lottery. Rainham, again, they were effective in reaching agreements, host and surrounding, and nearby communities. The host community referendum was passed by a very wide margin, and there's negligible opposition from public hearings and the comments we received here at the MGC. Their site location is some distance from the highway, a few miles, and they identified some limited roadway and transit mitigation. Additional off-site intersection improvements may be required. They also outlined a responsible gaming policy that is in place at Parks Casino in Pennsylvania, and they've agreed to apply with all of our regulations, and they as well have a signed agreement with the lottery. So that's just a summary of the work that was done and our overall findings with regard to these three applicants. Again, I want to reiterate that they're all quality applicants and have taken this process very seriously. Any questions of me?
This may be a question for tomorrow, but one thing that I'd like to look and understand a little bit more. Are we or were we ever concerned that any one of these surrounding community agreements, the contents of which may have been an overpromise or an overpayment, that we may have doubts as to whether some of those promises could be kept or are a little too much? I realize that the focus was the outcome, if the parties reached them, if they didn't get into arbitration, and this may be, of course, a more relevant question in the category 1s, I'm going to suspect, but just wanted to
Yeah,
throw that out there.
we had long discussions about whether or not we should be really evaluating the content and comparing to one another. It really made a decision. In fact, I did that was not, they were made and signed. Those communities are satisfied with those agreements. What we looked at was the process and evaluated the process. Gordon Carr spent the most time from our group, and really, he's read them. And we all discussed, pieces of them, but Gordon really spent an awful lot of time with these agreements. Do you have anything to add, Gordon?
Well, I haven't committed them all to memory, but we've spent a fair amount of time on them, and they vary a bit by community and by the priorities of each of those communities, and that's why it was sort of difficult to measure one against another. Many of them, and we'll go back to the question you asked about Bolton, that had very specific concerns about Route 107, and that agreement, for example, includes mutually agreed baseline studies and then future studies, and that whatever tangible, verifiable impact on Route 107 that can be measured related to the Leominster project will be mitigated by the applicant. So there are subtleties within each one of the different surrounding community agreements, but as far as overpromising, I think that's the obligation of the applicant that signed them, that if there is some overpromising down the road, that's something that I'm sure the municipalities and the applicants will have to work out.
Thank you.
I think this is consistent with our point all along, that we've never played a role in second guessing or judging or counseling or anything a host community for their agreements, or for that matter, surrounding communities. It's the legislature said this is a local deal, and to a very large extent, almost totally, we've let that be the case. So I think your approach is right.
Thanks. Anything else?
No, thank you.
Thank
Not
you
for me.
very much.
Thank
Thank
very
you.
much. Thank you.
Okay, let's take a quick break, let Commissioner Stebbins set up, and we'll be back in a few minutes.